Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Hamper. I currently work as a labs engineer at Acquia, which means I kind of get to play around with new technologies and see what they're capable of. Oftentimes I'm investigating how they might interact with Drupal or with other things. Some of the things I've been working with lately are conversational UIs and, in this case, JSON API. So, excuse me. Today I'm going to be talking about getting your content where you need it using JSON API. So first off, what is JSON API? It's an open standard, which means it's fully accessible to anybody to read and even to make suggestions. It actually has its own GitHub repo even. It helps you to create RESTful APIs quickly and consistently. It answers a lot of the smaller questions for you so that you don't have to spend a lot of time designing every little detail of your API. And so it describes a consistent way of exchanging data, often that has interrelated fields using JSON as the format. And it's often described as an anti-byte shedding tool because a lot of the little details that can slow down your API design process are already done for you. So what does JSON API enable? Its intent is to get content or data going between two or more systems that might be very different. It could be communicating across CMSs or JavaScript frameworks, different languages. It can be used to create decoupled front-end architectures where your back-end houses your data and your front-end is essentially a completely separate application that talks to your back-end using JSON API. And it really lends itself well to multi-channel content. So if you have a website and a mobile app, and you might even have a publicly accessible API or many other things like an Alexa, a conversational UI interface or something like that might need to get your content as well. So having it accessible in multiple ways in a consistent way is very valuable. That's something that JSON API is great at. So if you're coming from the Drupal world, you might ask, okay, I'm creating an API, why not just use core REST? And yes, core REST is a huge leap forward. It's great for getting your Drupal site working as a data backend, but it has some downsides. For one thing, configuration is a bit of a pain. You have the REST UI module, but you have a million checkboxes that you have to wade through sometimes to make changes. If you add a new authentication method, you have to check that off for every entity type. Or you can create your own config entities from scratch, which isn't much fun either. And also, REST doesn't really handle collections of entities great. You can get a single entity, but getting the list of all articles, it's a little more difficult. You have to create a views export to describe it, and you need to do that for each entity type or each type of sort, things like that. So you can wind up with dozens or even hundreds of views just to get all of your data for your API. And handling interrelated data isn't so great. For example, if you need to get all the information that relates to an article node, first you have to get the article itself, and then you need to get the user that authored it. And if it has a bunch of taxonomy terms, you need to get each of those separately. Each of these is a separate HTTP call, so you have extra round trips. And it also means your Drupal website is bootstrapping for each of these calls. That increases your load on your server, and it just takes a lot of time. And that just doesn't sound like much fun, does it? So how about JSON API? On Drupal, it's pretty simple. Enabling it is merely a matter of installing the contrib module. And after that, it uses Drupal's built-in users and permission system. It works for every entity automatically. And because you're using JSON API, it gives you all the power of that standard, which I'll get into next. So JSON API endpoints, the URLs that you use for your API, they follow a very consistent logical pattern that's described by the format itself. And it's pretty straightforward. You'll probably recognize it as a pretty typical API pattern anyway. For getting all articles, or getting all resources of the type article, you just use the one level of URL article. To get a specific article, you add the ID to the end of that. And with JSON API, you can even go further. If you add author at the end of that, it gets the author resource that's related to that article. So here you see the interrelated data being used and how JSON API makes that much easier. JSON API is just a RESTful API, so you communicate with it using HTTP requests. And here's an example for getting an article. You can see it's pretty straightforward. It has a specific content type that you specify, which marks it as using JSON API. And when you get the response, you'll get a JSON object back. If you work with JSON or JavaScript, you'll recognize that this is just the way of describing the data in a way that JavaScript understands natively. And it's often used in languages other than JavaScript as well. PHP has functions for manipulating JSON objects as well. But you can see at the top level, you'll always have a data item when you're requesting a resource. You'll see it has a type field or a type property and an ID property. The combination of those two always need to be unique because that's what uniquely identifies the resource. But you can have the same ID across resource types, no problem. The combination of the two just need to be unique. Below that, you see the attributes, which are the data for the resource itself, rather than the metadata that describes. In this case, we're talking about an article, so you see it has a title field and a body field. And then below that, you see the relationships are described. You have an author resource, and you can also see that it specifies the type and the ID of that so that it can be accessed separately. JSON API supports full CRUD operations, CRUD being an acronym for create, retrieve, update, or delete. Basically means you can manipulate the data any way you want. And it follows RESTful API conventions again. For creating a new resource, you use a post request. To get resources, you use a get request. To patch a resource, you use a patch request to update a resource. And you delete the resource. And an important point to make is only GET requests can involve multiple resources. All of the other operations always operate on one specific resource. So for example, creating a new resource, you use a post request. Here you can see that you're specifying the type so that it knows what type of resource you're creating, but you don't need to specify the ID. It will be determined once the resource is actually created. And you list out all the attributes for the object. And you can even declare relationships as you're creating a resource. So this will point to an existing person with an ID of 42. Similarly, for updating a resource, you use a patch request. In this case, you see you have to specify the type and the ID because you're modifying an existing resource. So this tells it what specific resource to modify. And you only have to specify the attributes that change. Everything that you don't specify will just be kept the same. Where a lot of the power of the JSON API format comes from is the more advanced things you can do with GET requests. One thing to note here is that the JSON API spec does leave some things up to the implementer. So depending on what server or what, like speaking with a Drupal-based server might be a little bit different than some other implementation. So sometimes you might have to read a bit of documentation to know what exactly it's expecting. But they generally follow these same patterns. So these examples will be specific for Drupal. For sorting resources, you add query parameters. All of these are specified using query parameters. And they have components to them. In this case, you have just an English kind of free-form name that you give to this operation that you're doing. In this case, I call it sort title just to make it kind of descriptive. And you give the path to what to sort on. In this case, I'm going to sort on the title field, so the path is just title. For more advanced sorting, well, if you want to reverse sort in the opposite direction, you need to use a two-part query parameter. And here you see that the name for the sort is repeated because it needs that to group these two separate query parameters together. And you specify the direction as descending instead of ascending. You can filter articles. For instance, you might want to filter all articles that have a user ID of 42. That's pretty straightforward. But if you want to do something more complex, like filtering by date, you might need to use a multi-part query again. In this case, you have the path again, specifying that you're sorting by created date. And here you can specify a value and an operator that you're comparing against. And pagination, if you have 1,000 articles on your site, you might not want to return them all with one request. So JSON API supports pagination, and you essentially just specify the starting offset that you want returned first, and the limit of resources that you want returned. So in this case, it skips to the 20th item, starting from 0, and it only returns up to 10 items. And the very best thing about JSON API is it's a standard. So a lot of CMSs, I know WordPress and Drupal both have implementations of this. A lot of frameworks like Ember have it available out of the box, or have a library that you can easily add on to whatever you're working on, and you might get JSON API without really much effort. In fact, in an ideal case, you might not even need to know how the JSON API standard works, in which case I've kind of wasted 15 minutes of your time, so I apologize for that. But hopefully it'll come in handy sometime. Oh, yes. Yeah, there are libraries for Java, Android, iOS, and Ember.js, which is something I'm going to use for a demo today. Is built to use JSON API out of the box, so you don't even need to install anything extra. So what can we do with JSON API? I'll give you a couple of demonstrations of Ember applications that I've written. They use Drupal 8 as a backend with the JSON API contrib module, and Ember as the front end. As I said, installing JSON API on Drupal is pretty straightforward. It's a matter of installing the module itself and enabling it. And if you're using your front end on a different origin, then you need to enable Core's cross-origin request sharing configuration. That is what browsers require to have web pages talking between domains. And it's mainly a matter of cutting and pasting code into your services.yaml file. You can find more documentation on what each of these options does. And similarly, Ember is pretty easy to get going. As I said, it has JSON API in it out of the box, but to handle some of the quirks with Drupal specifically, go back to that caveat a few slides ago, there's actually a module, an add-on that somebody created for it that handles a lot of those quirks for you. And for creating an Ember app, one thing that's really,
Is this in your Drupal root? Where you're running Ember in it?
No, this would be as kind of a separate route for your front-end application. It might be in the same repo or in separate repos, but you generally want to keep them separated somehow. Yeah. And a really cool thing about Ember, how many people have worked with Ember before? Okay. A really cool thing about Ember is it comes with its own development environment. There's a command line tool that you can just type Ember in it, and it spins everything up for you. It has it has a watch task so that it checks for code change and rebuilds the application every time you change your code. It allows you to generate new components within your Ember app using simple command line operations. So it's just a really easy framework to get started in. It's also very opinionated, so there's sort of a specific path that you follow to do something, which makes it a bit easier to learn for some people. So if you're starting with Ember from scratch, you would create the Ember application using Ember init. You install the add-on that I mentioned. And then there's just a few lines of glue code to use that add-on. In this case, I'm creating an adapter. An adapter tells JSON API what endpoints to talk to on your backend. And in this case, it needs to know what your backend host is, and the namespace, which is the root of the API URL. JSON API is how Drupal's contrib module is designed for its namespace out of the box. And you create a serializer that's basically just a copy of the add-on code. The serializer tells JSON API how to convert your native object into JSON and back again. And you need to create, the add-on lets you specify which entities you're going to work with and not worry about the rest. In this case, you just tell it you're going to work with articles, so it will pull those into a model. And Ember works using models, routes, and templates. The models hold your data, templates describe how to display that data to the user, and routes give the URL that your application responds to. It's pretty similar to the model that a lot of JavaScript application frameworks use. And so with just a couple dozen lines of code, you're all set. So a demo. First, I'll show you a JSON or an Ember front end that I was able to create in just an hour or two from scratch. So that just goes to show that it's really easy to use these technologies out of the box. I have a Drupal 8 site setup. Oh, that's a little bit small. So here I have a Drupal 8 website that I have set up. It's just a basic install of Drupal 8, which I added the JSON API module to already. And so sort of the example that I'm having here is if you're creating a blog website, you might have articles for your blog articles. So here we have the front page view of all your content, and you can see I have 3 different articles here. And you can click into each one. It's talking to the Drupal server or the Drupal site on the server, and loading it. And you can see very clearly that each navigation is using a separate request. And there's a full page redraw on the browser. That's your typical out-of-the-box Drupal experience. And it's pretty speedy because there's not a lot going on the website, but it's still noticeable even for a brand new website. So to compare that, I'm going to spin up my front end. And this is the Ember application. And then here, you'll notice the first time I go to the site or to the application, it took a little bit of time to load, but not that much. But now when I'm navigating around, it's pretty much appearing instantly. We don't have any page refreshes or redraws. You're not waiting for the server to respond, and that's because the Ember application has fetched all of my articles on the first request and has gotten all the interrelated data that was needed to render those. So all of those are actually held locally in my Ember application. So it doesn't have to keep talking back and forth between the server and the application to get those as needed. It saves those and it lazy loads from the back end. When you make a request to check if anything has changed, but it will still draw what it has already immediately. And then if it finds out something has changed later, it will redraw and show the updates.
Is there any issues between if you're using HTTPS?
So the question was, are there any issues with using HTTPS? No, there isn't really a significant difference. As long as it's configured as you normally would, I can't think of any issues that you would run into.
Would you just need to add the HTTPS instead of the HTTP in your GET request?
Yeah, in the adapter that you're writing, yeah, you would use HTTPS in the host name. So this is a very simple demonstration, and like I said, it only took an hour or two to create from scratch. But if you wanted to put some more time into it, I'll show you another example of an application that does full CRUD operations. This is something, oops. So this is a completely separate Ember application, and it will be talking to a different backend, so you'll see the data will be different as well. It's mostly just auto-generated content. But in this case, the application, it gives you articles, users, and tags all from the Drupal website. Those are just the out-of-the-box content types that you get, or entities that you get with Drupal. But here you can see I'm displaying all of those to the user rather than just working with articles. Again, you can see the first access takes a little time, but then when you're navigating around, things start loading immediately. And I created a simple form to edit things. Uh-oh. Curse of the demo. Yeah. So saving and deleting don't appear to be working, but the application is capable of doing that. Okay, I know why. I forgot to log in. That would help. This application uses OAuth 2. Again, it's really easy to use out of the box, and it works with very little configuration, so it's kind of a quick win. And now I should actually be able to change things. There. Okay. And you can see the title's been updated. You also see when I go to authors, you can see some of them have appeared immediately. Those were the ones that were already loaded from before, and then it loads the rest as soon as it can. And the same for tags. And you can even go into tags, and using relationships, it figures out what articles have those tags. And you can very easily interconnect your data. So here are some useful links if you want to read more. The JSON API format is available at the first link. And then I have the config module and some Ember documentation. And the Ember add-on is the bottom link that I use to get things spun up quickly. And that's it. Anybody have any questions?
Yeah, so in your examples you showed accessing like content entities. Is there, maybe it's the wrong way to think about it, but is there an opportunity to access either content entities using the Drupal view mode concept, or to access like similar things that are maybe configuration around the system?
You currently can get configuration entities, but I don't think there's the capability of modifying them yet. As for view modes, this is kind of working outside of that. It doesn't go through the view mode stack to get the data. It's just getting your raw data from the entity itself.
So I guess it's kind of follow maybe for images, for example, like that's a common use case where you might have different image like formats for different things. So I guess right now would you basically sort of manually configure your templates on the Ember side or on the whatever other application you were using to kind of know to go and access them at a different path for the Drupal side? Like if you set up like a teaser or something.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be something currently that you need to do on your front end. You can get the URL to the image itself very easily to do things with view modes, or not view modes, image styles. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I don't think it has that functionality yet. That's
Okay.
something not implemented yet, but yeah.
Thanks.
So I have a client that has an Ember app that I'm starting to engage with. What are they, I mean, they don't have like a mobile app that they're using it with. I'm not quite sure why the other developer put it forward. What are the advantages of going with an Ember front end over just using Drupal? Is there particular advantages that they're going to be able to take advantage of?
Yeah, I think the main advantage is for a decoupled architecture in general, you have separation of concerns. So your backend dev team and front-end dev team could theoretically work separately as long as they have a way of coordinating to make sure that they're staying in sync. But you could hire a team of JavaScript developers who know nothing about Drupal theoretically, and they can create your front end, and all they need to know is your JSON API interface. So they don't have to worry about the Drupalisms and the way that the backend is specifically implemented. They can just focus on the application and how it is meant to behave, rather than worrying about what Drupal is doing behind the scenes. So that's one of the biggest advantages to a decoupled architecture. And the other advantage is if you're going to be using it in multiple channels, you essentially get that free once you have that API defined.
Okay. Thanks.
Do you think, would you see this being useful? Would this be overkill, I guess? Like if you wanted to go the traditional theming route for your Drupal site, but you have a feature that you may want to make more dynamic. Do you think the JSON API is that too heavy-handed then to try to bring that in for if you didn't want to totally decouple? Would you then? I mean, I guess it depends on what the feature may be, but
there are some people who are exploring that avenue. My take on it is it seems a bit overkill because it just seems like there are easier ways to access that data than going through JSON API. But there are some people who are exploring that and seeing if it makes sense, where it makes sense. I know one developer who has worked on the JSON API module. He is exploring creating a twig filter or a twig handler to access data through JSON API. So yeah, he's just exploring what might come from that.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, you showed text fields, kind of like title and body, pretty like simpler Drupal field bundles, or so for the more complex ones, like maybe things like paragraphs or other maybe custom entity types. Are those things that either are they supported by that module, or are they things that you might have to add a plugin to sort of figure out how to process those things and remove lots of the sort of complexities to just send back the important information to the JSON API?
Yeah, that's a good question. For something like paragraphs or where you have nested entities and then those entities have fields on them, you'll probably have to load those paragraph entities into a separate model, and then in your Ember application you would do that figuring out of how things are interconnected. For compound fields, like the body field actually has multiple values on that, and for this edit form I had to address that, or I had to figure out how to access that using Ember, and it's pretty straightforward. The article model is just an object, and it has the body field as a member of that object, and then its value, its summary, its text format are all separate submembers underneath that member. So for things like I think addresses are implemented that way as well. So things like that you can handle pretty easily. Something like paragraphs where you have separate entities, you might have to do a slightly more circuitous approach.
So are you getting, I guess as a follow-up, are you getting basically whatever you would see if you got the variable in PHP and it had whatever it comes with, or like the main features?
Yeah, pretty similar, yes. It has some of the relationships figured out for you in a bit more easily used way, and Ember will make it a bit easier to make those interrelations, like the author of an article can very easily link to a user model. It kind of figures out some of those interconnections for you.
Thanks.
But you're essentially dealing with the raw data, yes.
So you used an article. What would happen when I started creating custom fields on that article? Would I be using the label to identify the JSON, or would I use the machine name to identify the link images?
Well, when you're adding fields to an entity, you're still dealing with that same entity, so it will still be included with that same JSON API response. In Ember, it will use the same model. It will just have new members added to it, so it'll have like for the field, for a tags field, it has a field tags member, and you would have field image, field paragraphs, field whatever. It just adds to the article model.
So when you get this response back, I'm looking at the 7th slide or something like that. You got the article and the type and the ID, and then you got attributes, title, body, with the fields then be like
Yes.
to be address or something like that. There'd be data would flow wherever that field finds.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think part of the question was, it sounds like it's using the machine name, so if like it's your custom fields all are prefixed with field whatever, like field category, if you made one, it would show up in the JSON as field category.
Yes, yeah, it currently uses the machine names. There's some work that I'm doing to try and simplify that, kind of abstract away some of the Drupalisms so that people who aren't Drupal developers don't have to understand why you prefix some things with field and some things you don't. But that will basically be just a mapping between machine names and the simpler names. But currently, yes, it uses machine names for the fields. Okay. So thank you again for coming and all your questions. And my slides are available online, as well as the simple demo application. The more complex one I'm working on still, and hopefully there will be a release of that before DrupalCon as an example for using Ember with Drupal and JSON API. And my intent is to make that into sort of a framework that makes it easier to spin up those applications. So hopefully that will be in place for DrupalCon. Let's see. And if you want to hear more about that, find out if I've made progress with that, feel free to get in touch with me by email. And thank you again.